just like, you'll be reading a paragraph and you'll be like, yes, that's exactly it. You're so right. Like, speak, like, let him know. And then all of a sudden at the end, he'll be like, that's why testosterone is exactly the same thing as using heroin. And you're like, bro, what are you talking about?
That I'm ready to go. Heartbeat, my heartbeat, doo doo. I want you to know whenever you are around. Can't speak, I can't speak. Dun, dun.
There's no introduction, fucking introduction. All my homies hate introductions. By way of content warning, this video is a theoretical and emotional deep dive into the process of taking testosterone. It deals with topics like doctors, transphobia, transmedicalism, eugenics, and there are several clips depicting needles. I finally started taking T. I'm not really that interested in using this as a direct linear transition diary because it's all kind of ongoing and always will be, but for interest I will mark the duration of time I've been taking testosterone on each of the clips that I show during this video. Because I'm a deeply damaged person, I have to over-intellectualize everything and have university professors tell me what to do and what to think, so I was interested to seek out other people's experiences of testosterone. I found a bunch of them in the course of the project that became my last video, Notes Toward a Transmasc Sexual Politics. But more so, as I began the process of getting a prescription and taking testosterone, I wanted an analysis of why and how people take this substance, how it fits into politics and the world as a whole, and I kept finding references to this book, Testo Junkie by Paul B. Preciado. Let's pretend that didn't happen. Everything's great here, you guys.
So for this drawing, I kind of had a really clear idea of where I wanted to go with it. I think that something that's kind of emerged as a theme throughout this whole process for me is like, how is Preciado like a figure in the story, and like what is his sort of like character arc?
So before I start with talking about this, I feel like I have to explain Preciado's whole situation at the time of writing the book, because it accounts for a lot of why the book's like that. And I will come back to this more in depth later. So basically, at the time Preciado wrote this book, he was primarily presenting as a woman, using the name he was assigned at birth, and not identifying as a transsexual, which in his case he was defining at the time to mean a person who's taking hormones according to a course of treatment prescribed by a doctor. The book is a chronicle of him as he goes out and gets testosterone gel extracurricularly through a friend and takes it on his own. Essentially, the book alternates between two or really three types of section. There's lots of parts of it that are straightforwardly telling you history or information about the pharmaceutical availability of hormones. In particular, he focuses on testosterone gel and estrogen-based birth control, commonly referred to as the pill. These parts of the book are honestly great. For example, he describes how Puerto Rico already had a long history of governmental birth control programs, such as how in 1917 the U.S. government and PR's ruling classes drew up a population control plan, leading to the 1925's formation of the Birth Control League by Jose Lanause Rolón, alongside the U.S. instituting laws in 1907 giving the state the right to sterilize people against their will, which, at least as of 2022, when I first began to write this apparently, still the case in 31 states and DC. I feel like I always kind of abstractly understood the idea that the pill was tested on women of color in Puerto Rico, but reading in detail about the way they essentially built prison camps for low-income black and indigenous women so that they could learn how to do birth control, sterilizing them in the process, was both fascinating and horrifying. And it's even more horrifying to learn that because of this, 35% of Puerto Rican women were permanently sterilized, and similar experiments have been tried in Mexico on indigenous Hawaiians and on indigenous folks in the United States. Preciado doesn't mention, by the way, but we can't forget the syphilis experiments that were conducted at the Tuskegee Institute on black students and at residential schools, not to mention the basis of gynecology itself in experiments done on enslaved women. Based on the only book I've ever read, take a shot. C. Riley Thornton, black on both sides. In this context, when we look at what happened in Puerto Rico, we can only see it as part of a particular racial politics of that place, or perhaps Latinidad in general. The idea of mestizaje, or mejorando la raza, literally played out on the bodies of black and morena women in Puerto Rico's slums.
I'm a brown skin lady with a brown skin baby, and I'll keep making more. I'll keep making more. I'm a brown skin lady with a brown skin baby, and I'll keep making more. I'll keep making more. I'll keep making more. I'ma keep making more. I'll keep making more. I'ma keep making more. I'll keep making more.
Testo Junkie also contains some memoir sections. These often focus either on Preciado taking testosterone, reflecting on the effects, a lot of sex scenes, and also accounts of writing the book. But seriously, you guys, there are so many sex scenes, and like, on the one hand, they're sometimes beautiful, but on the other, they're just kind of silly sometimes simultaneously. Her pelvis is glued to mine, her vulva connected to mine, our organs gnawing each other like the muzzles of two dogs that recognize each other. As we screw, I feel as if my entire political history, all my years of feminism, are moving directly toward the center of her body and flowing into it, as if her skin provided their only real niche. When I come, Wittig and Davis and Wolfe and Solanas, La Pasionaria, Kate Bornstein and Annie Sprinkle bubble up with me. She's covered with my feminism as if with a diaphanous ejaculation, a sea of political sparkles. Many of the personal sections of the book, and perhaps the book as a whole, are addressed to you, gay French author Guillaume Destin, who had recently passed away as of the writing of the book, and with whom Preciado seems to have had a, conflicted friendship. In one section, there's a flashback to talking about artificial insemination so that Preciado could carry Destin's baby, even though at the time Destin was living with HIV, so it was unclear how serious this plan was. But then it's immediately followed by a scene taking place shortly after Destin's death. Put on the black v-necked sweater and sneakers I was wearing the night we went out together, and I saw a hairy gorilla fucking you in the ass as you got your kicks like some little 15-year-old chick. I've corrected several pages that I wrote during the last few days. I don't really know what to do with the bizarre homophobia of this description, let alone the fact that at the end, Preciado seems to imply that this part of the narrative, and perhaps other parts, aren't true. Destin, in fairness, is quite an asshole back to Preciado. He keeps saying lesbophobic stuff to him, and keeps insisting on calling him a lesbian even when Preciado tells him he identifies as a man now. This strange homophobia is a theme we're gonna have to come back to, though. The third type of section in Testo Junkie is sort of a wobbly in-between. Some of them are sort of free associations / poetry on themes of gender presentation and hormones. Others include a proposal that he has for all assigned female at birth people to take testosterone, which he argues will both serve as birth control and also somehow erase homophobia.
Like, I keep returning to that example that he gives of, like, wanting to have cis women be given testosterone as a form of birth control, which, again, like, dubious whether that is a thing that happens, mostly because it's not very well studied, but, you know, all evidence points that it is relatively effective as a contraceptive, or at least, like, it prevents a reasonable number of ovulations. But then he argues that, like, that would abolish heterosexuality, and, like, part of it is that, like, Preciado is so deep in internalized homophobia land at the time of writing this book that, like, he can't actually imagine gay sex for real, and so he just, like, speculates about what if, like, straight people were accidentally doing a gay sex, which is entertaining for sure. But upshot of that is that he argues that if cis women take testosterone, then, like, all sex between cis men and cis women will, like, become gay, like, just instantly because of, you know, the whatever, like, masculinizing body effects of testosterone, and then also just, like, the fact that the person would, like, therefore immediately be perceived as male. But, like, bro, you literally just got done telling us about how throughout the 20th century, the creation of contraceptive pills changed people's bodies and things that were deemed natural about people's bodies. And as a consequence, gender roles and social roles changed, but still remained heterosexual and still remained dimorphic. And that nonetheless, patriarchy still exists, heterosexuality still exists. And not only that, the pharmaceutical regime, or whatever the fuck it's called, means that, like, every person who takes the pill is now responsible for monitoring themselves and monitoring their body, taking the pill at the same time every day, making sure not to take the pill during the particular week when you're supposed to get a period, though anecdotally most people I know still take it because they don't want to get a period. Who fucking would? And then that person also, you know, like, still has to take pregnancy tests sporadically in case the contraceptive fails. In theory, could still fail, and then they're still subject to, you know, increasingly dystopianly, the state telling them you have to carry this baby to term, and this, like, colossal risk. And so how are you out here arguing that, like, if we change the substance that we make these people self-administer to themselves, to ourselves, testosterone instead of estrogen, what the fuck difference did that make if we still do it in the context of heteropatriarchy? And I think that's what's so, like, limited about it, is it sort of falls prey to this, like, white queer attitude that, like, simply because I am a transsexual, that suddenly, like, heterosexuality will be abolished, that the patriarchy will be abolished. And it's like, no, like, so many times throughout history, these structures have changed who they're in groups and out groups are so that they can, and, like, what those bodies and people even look like, as you just discussed, and who, as discussed in great detail, the gender delusion, by Cordelia Fine, one of the only 3 books I've ever read. Just by being gay, just by being trans, doesn't necessarily abolish the patriarchy in the way that you think it does, bro. And I think we'll come back to this a few times.
Also, there are some just like truly galaxy-brained hand-drawn charts and diagrams. Like, truly, what is going on here? Like, a lot of Preciado's theory rests on this term he uses called the pharmacopornographic era. Unfortunately, he couches this in a lot of jargon and explains it very badly toward the beginning of the book. The term pharmacopornographic refers to the processes of a biomolecular, pharmaco, and semiotic technical pornographic government of sexual subjectivity, of which the pill and playboy are paradigmatic offspring, beginning in scientific discoveries of the 19th century, but fully emerging after the collapse of Fordist economies in the West in the 1970s. To clarify how this economy works, quote, we must first elaborate a new philosophical concept in the pharmacopornographic domain that is the equivalent to the force of work in the domain of classical economics. I call potentia gaudendi, or orgasmic force, the real or virtual strength of a body's total excitation. Current capitalism tries to put to work the potentia gaudendi in whichever form in which it exists, whether this be in its pharmacological form, a consumable molecule and material agency that will operate within the body of the person who's digesting it, as a pornographic representation, a semi-technical sign that can be converted into numeric data or transferred into digital, televisual, or telephonic media, or as a sexual service, a live pharmacopornographic entity whose orgasmic force and emotional volume are put in service to a consumer during a specified time, according to a more or less formal set of services.
Dude, check it out!
Yeah, like literally what the fuck was that? Basically, if I were to try and re-explain it more straightforwardly, Preciado is building on the previous generation of theorists from the mid-20th century, like Foucault, who talks about how power operates on people's bodies through disciplinary regimes like incarceration, borders, imprisonment. To say now, we have a regime that's based on the one hand, sexual desire, and on the other, the ability to manipulate our very bodies using drugs of various kinds. So basically, Foucault said, we used to have kings and knights for keeping order, and then eventually we evolved prisons and police, and that's called the disciplinary regime. And Preciado is like, hey, check this actually. We've moved beyond prisons. People can alter and surveil their own bodies now instead, so now we must have a pharmacopornographic regime. And let's ignore for now that, of course, we have not moved beyond prisons. Preciado also has some more really galaxy-brain graphics to describe the transition between the disciplinary regime and the pharmacopornographic regime, which I'm sure I'll show you here. If you have the desire, you can pause and try to decipher them, but to me they look like absolute fucking gibberish. He also seems to be developing the work of Judith Butler, or at least he thinks he is, by looking into how biological sex can be altered to suit the norms of gender. But honestly, Butler was already writing this as early as Gender Trouble itself. Quote, if the immutable character of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was always already gender, with the consequence that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all. I was pretty skeptical of this whole pharmacopornographic regime thing, but then I thought about the fucking Carl's Jr. Flat Buns commercial. Real Zennials remember and probably repressed this one. Like, literally, why did this need to be horny?
Well, I like 'em really hot, I like 'em really flat, I like 'em looking just like a pancake stack. Flat buns, I like flat buns. I like the flat ones.
The Patty Melt on flat buns, only at Carl's Jr.
In the pharmacopornographic era, the body swallows power. It is a form of control that is both democratic and private, edible, drinkable, inhalable, and easy to administer, whose spread throughout the social body has never been so rapid or so undetectable. The pharmacopornographic age, biopower dwells at home, sleeps with us, inhabits within. The dominant manifestations of the pharmacopornographic era, pills, prostheses, food, images, fellatio, and double penetration, share the same relationship between the body and power, a desire for infiltration, absorption, total occupation. It is not power infiltrating from the outside. It is the body desiring power, seeking to swallow it, eat it, administer it, wolf it down more, always more, through every hole, by every possible route of application, turning oneself into power. Baise-moi, fuck me, says the body, all while seeking forms of auto-control and auto-extermination. Personally, I've come to find Preciado's idea of the pharmacopornographic era really fascinating, and I go back and forth about how useful I think it is. Like, I'll unpack this more later, but I question the uniqueness of the medicine that's present today. Not to mention that Preciado is just straight up ahistorical at times, saying shit like there's no porn without the pill or without Viagra, but quoting Roman porn in the epigraph of the book. I also truly think there's something badass in cyberpunk that trans people have always gravitated to about the way we're able to alter our bodies, and how often that puts us at the cutting edge of science and medical technology. However, Preciado doesn't see this as straightforwardly a good thing. He sees pharmacopornographic regime as enforcing the status quo just as much as opening new possibilities. A multitude of potential consumers have increasing access to the molecular production of their gender and sexuality, heralding a new type of high-tech heterosexuality. The techno-Barbie, remaining eternally young and super-sexualized, almost entirely infertile and non-menstruating, but always ready for artificial insemination, and accompanied by a sterile super macho whose erections are technically produced by a combination of Viagra and audiovisual pornographic codes emitted through computerized digital channels. It's probably worth going back and talking about Preciado's whole deal with not identifying as trans. To a certain extent, we can interpret this as a critique of what we would now call transmedicalism. To declare himself trans, quote, I'll have to accept being born in a bio-body with which I don't identify, as if a body could be a material given that is there before linguistic or political action, and claim that I detest my body, my reproductive organs, and my way of getting an orgasm. I'll have to rewrite my history, modify all the elements in it that belong under the narrative of being female. I'll have to employ a series of extremely calculated falsehoods. I've always hated Barbie dolls. I'm repulsed by my breasts and my vagina. Vaginal penetration makes me sick, and the only way I can have an orgasm is with a dildo. Like, with a strap on? I don't know if these phrases make sense back to back. All this could be partly true and partly nonsense. In other words, I'll have to declare myself mentally ill and conform to the criteria established for the DSM-4 for gender dysphoria, or gender identity disorder as it was called at the time. In describing his transition, he says, quote, I decide to keep my legal identity as a woman and to take testosterone without subscribing to a sex change protocol. It's a bit like biting the dick that's raping you, the pharmacopornographic system's dick. This is so fucking metal. Like, no notes, unironically. However, there are places where it's clear that he doesn't actually think of himself as being among trans people, which in typical early Audis fashion, he refers to as transsexuals. Quote, actually, my gesture would lack strength were it not for the legions of silent transsexuals for whom the molecule, the protocol, and the change of legal identity are essential. Similarly, in this quote, he says, quote, we ought not to be surprised to discover that substances with similar anti-androgen effects are used voluntarily by transsexuals who are beginning a process of feminization. And in this quote, it again feels like when he says the word transsexual, that this is a category that he doesn't see himself as part of. Maybe just even above. In this quote, it especially seems like by transsexual he means trans woman, and as we'll see, misogyny is a recurring theme in this book. This disavowal of transness he keeps going through is especially strange because as of 2024, Preciado has in fact legally changed his name, pronouns, and gender marker. Part of it kinda just feels like cope on his part. Like at the time he was writing this, he was for some reason set out against identifying as a guy, even though he's already doing testosterone, so he's come up with a rationale for being that way. He doesn't want to acknowledge that he's trans and having a gender euphoria while he's taking testosterone, so instead he couches his transition in the language of addiction. If I don't accept defining myself as a transsexual, as someone with gender dysphoria, I must admit that I'm addicted to testosterone. As soon as a body abandons the practices that society deems masculine or feminine, it drifts gradually toward pathology. My biopolitical options are as follows. Either I declare myself to be a transsexual, or I declare myself to be drugged and psychotic. There's so many moments in this book where he's just like fucking cooking. Like he's just like whipping up a multi-course meal on the stove. He's giving a little sprinkle here and there. And then he just drops a fucking dog turd in it. In the medical protocol, changing sex implies making a unique decision, a choice made once and once only. But things are more complex than that. I don't want to change my sex, and I don't want to declare myself dysphoric about whatever it may be. I don't want to go to a doctor to decide how much testosterone a month is suitable for changing my voice and making me grow a beard. I don't want to have my ovaries and breasts removed. Even if I do not want to procreate, I don't want my reproductive cells to be hijacked by the state. I don't want my uterus to be confiscated by the medical industrial complex. The problem is as follows. Outside the institutional context defined by the state, testosterone is no longer part of a therapy of hormonal substitution and becomes an illegal drug, just like cocaine or heroin. The consequences, in legal and medical terms, of my rejection of the protocol must therefore be admitted. I'm addicted to testosterone.
Dude, check it out!
Like, my brother in Satan, literally no one has demanded that you use this framework of addiction. No one has used it before. and I can only see bad outcomes from it. But like, go off, I guess. This oppositional attitude that he has toward transness in general kind of reminds me of gender nihilism. At the time that she was writing this, Alison Escalante was a young trans girl who was unable but wanted to medically transition, but she developed essentially an attitude of utter despair, which she then termed as radical negativity and anti-humanism, a type of gender abolition founded on total lack of hope or plans to improve anything. I first encountered this theory as a teenager on Tumblr when I too was trapped in an abusive situation and unable to medically transition, and at the time, I found it really appealing. However, as I grew up and realized that my feelings about gender abolition were about more than just fuck everything, let's burn the world down. Everyone who tries to make their life better is just a capo and a collaborator. And, you know, the best thing is, Alison Escalante's own response to her initial gender nihilism essay is also really informative. Quote, "So, what comes after gender nihilism? It is certainly not a politics of radical negation. It is not a refusal to engage in positive political struggle. It is not a refusal to define our demands. Rather, what comes after gender nihilism must be a materialist struggle against patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism, which understands and is attentive to the complex interrelations between these structures, and which refuses to reduce any one of them to any other. This requires daring imaginations of new futures, discussion and communication, and theoretical development, which demands not just abolition, but a way to actually achieve it, and a clear set of materialist theoretical principles and praxis to unite around. The abolition of gender will only be achieved as a result of the abolition of the material conditions which reinforce it with their ideologies of sexual difference. This means destroying the capitalist system, which produces the nuclear family as a fundamental social structure. This means overcoming colonialism and white supremacy, which rely on gendered discourses to justify their violence and establish ideologies of hypersexuality and deviance. This means recognizing that these things can only be overcome by a communist politics oriented toward the future. Abandon nihilism, abandon hopelessness, demand and build a better world." The first time I took testosterone couldn't have been more different than what Preciado describes for himself. It was Trans Day of Remembrance, last year. The night before, I had announced in a community drag show that we would have a vigil. It wasn't planned by anyone other than me and a couple of friends. The November wind guttered out the candles as we read the names of our dead. Hundreds of names, mostly black women and Latinas, mostly sex workers. We scrawled the names in chalk on a nearby building, then retreated inside to drink hot chocolate and tea. That morning, I'd had the telehealth appointment with my doctor. It was supposed to be informed consent, but just like at the intake, she was still interviewing me, still asking me about my penchant for having sex with men, how I masturbated, why I didn't take birth control, and what I would do if I got pregnant. She gave me a much lower dose of testosterone than I'd asked for. They didn't prescribe me needles. I was just supposed to go to the clinic at a week later to be shown by a nurse how to do the injections and pick up the needles then. I went to the pharmacy right away and pretended the prescription was supposed to include needles. The pharmacy gave them to me for free. Shout out. That evening, we sat around the big main table of the building we'd chalked up, a community center with art studios in it, drinking instant Okinawa milk tea. Maybe 12 of us, recent friends and acquaintances from the local queer community. A friend of mine, Alex, who I had met that night, showed me how to do the injection with the others watching. When I was done, everyone applauded.
Yay!
A person I just met made me a commemorative plate. It's a far cry from what Preciado describes, standing alone in his bathroom with a packet of gel, developing what he would characterize as an addiction. The silver package, containing a 50 milligram dose of testosterone in gel form, is the same size as a small packet of sugar. I rip into the aluminum-coated paper. It comes out as a thin, cold, transparent gel that disappears immediately into the skin of my left shoulder. A cool vapor remains, like a memory of icy breath, the kiss of a snow woman. Since our first time doing it together, my friend Alex and I have met many times on Sundays to do our shots together, an active ritual of solidarity. Preciado always reports taking his testosterone alone. I don't tell you this to say the way that I did it was right and his way was wrong, by the way. If I had been able to simply be given testosterone by a friend years before, I would have taken it. I didn't become a man when the doctor wrote the prescription or when I injected my first shot. And I always followed her instructions. But because I think because I had community, it made me feel like I was part of something. Whereas Preciado's book is very much a description of a solitary descent into addiction, and to this underworld of sexuality and arcane body changes. In the movie Orlando, directed by Preciado, there's a scene focusing on a young trans woman going to a psychiatrist's office to gain a diagnosis that will allow her to take hormones.
Je suis Lise Christin, et dans ce film, je serai l'Orlando de Virginia Woolf.
First we see the doctor interrogating her about her attraction to girls, inquiring about whether she hates her body.
La question autrement, plus directement, détestez-vous vos organes sexuels, par exemple? votre pénis.
Non, j'ai un pénis féminin. Et ça ne me pose aucun problème.
Pénis féminin. Intéressant.
Before she returns to the waiting room, the other femmes discuss how to game the system, what to tell the doctor, while an older trans man offers to give a younger man testosterone on the spot, transitioning into a dance number entitled Pharmaco Liberation.
Ça va? J'y vais.
Rude bitch. This little shit. Do you wanna know what's in it?
Do you wanna come with us? Pharmaco liberation.
I'm not saying my experience was like that. Thank the deities nobody fucking sang. I wasn't liberated. I still got my testosterone through a doctor, and I still went my own way and raised my dosage to what I understand to be a normal dose, what I take now, and what feels good to me, having to fight my doctor in the process. Which, like, tangent, but I really hate how doctors are obsessed with managing transitions as slowly and as minimally as they can. They really just want to give you the least dose that will make you shut up and hopefully change as little as possible about your body in the process. They just, like, fundamentally can't understand why you're doing this, and so they're determined to prevent you from doing anything they deem as drastic. This at least unites both myself and Preciado, really any trans person I don't especially like. No matter how annoying I find them, we can always unite around hating doctors. Even now as I film and edit this, I'm not sure if I'm going to continue to have access to a legal prescription because the free clinic I used to be seen at has closed, and I don't have Canadian health insurance. Preciado couldn't escape the structures of gender either. Like, I don't know, even in his recent stuff, he frames beginning to identify and present himself as a man as a type of convenience to make himself legible to the state.
So yes, so basically that's how I started transitioning, more like really trying to think or trying to experiment transformation of my political identity and writing about it at the same time, and then doing a political genealogy of hormones and so on, right? But I didn't want to go into the medical system and accept the gender dysphoria label as transformation started to happen. I got to understand things that I could have not imagined just by thinking about them. Like basically when my body was perceived differently from the outside, and so differently than then my passport became obsolete. And then I started to think much more about the logic of representation that we all work with. My body became my homeless condition as well, because even my body could not be my house since it was not recognized by the legal system, by the administration system.
But like, having a transsexual body is never convenient or easy, and becoming intelligible to the government causes its own problems. For example, story time. Last year, shortly after starting to take testosterone, I contracted a UTI for reasons that were definitely my own fault. And now, in Canada, apparently, pharmacists can simply prescribe you antibiotics for UTIs, but only if you're assigned female at birth and or a woman. That terminology confusion, by the way, is still unresolved. Different sources say different things. So I called the pharmacy and explained my situation, and based on my voice on the phone, they were willing to give me antibiotics, which, ouch. But then, when I gave them my info, they saw that apparently when I picked up my T prescription, thus starting a file at this pharmacy, that they had apparently put me down as a man. I explained my whole deal to them, even offered to show up in person and show them that my driver's license still said F, but they still wouldn't give me the antibiotics because, quote, our system says you're a man. Like, what was I supposed to do? Whip my infected pussy out in the pharmacy? And Preciado has his own examples of the absurdness of making your trans body legible to institutions. For example, in the chat with Halberstam, he describes the difficulty of changing his name, both in terms of choosing one, which, like, this motherfucker really tried to be named Subcomandante Marcos as a literal white Spanish person. Like, bro, come on. But also in that conversation, he talks about the state wanting him to leave his dead name behind, which he wanted to keep as a middle name, but which was not masculine enough for the judge.
I think that was let's say, a moment for me to actually as well kind of negotiate utopia as well, in the sense that I really had to go back to the medical system and then say, well, okay, I accept being called gender dysphoric. I accept I'm gonna sign all these pages. I'm gonna get a lawyer. Okay, let me think. I have to think of a male name now, and I'm gonna change my gender on legally, right?
Also, the way that Preciado uses addiction and porn throughout this book is just really icky in my opinion. He stigmatizes both of those things by comparing the state and patriarchal logics to the way that porn and drugs are negatively stereotyped. For example, speaking about porn, he says, quote, "Pornography is a masturbatory virtual device. The goal of pornography is planetary multimedia masturbation. The pornographic image is characterized by its ability to stimulate, independently of the spectator's will, the biochemical and muscular mechanisms that regulate the production of pleasure, what Linda Williams calls the embodied image. Pornography is sexuality transformed into spectacle, becoming marketable, a device for the publication of the private." But then, he goes off the rails and starts comparing sex work to slavery. If Angela Davis' argument is transposed to the sex industry, the penal industrial complex and the domains of work in pornography and prostitution seem a fresh expedient for the continuation of the economy of slavery at the heart of Western democratic societies. Meanwhile, for a book with the word junkie in the title, it does absolutely no examination of the disciplinary structures around addiction and the use of criminalized substances.
Despite its title, Testo Junkie actually doesn't engage with addiction as a topic very much at all in the course of its runtime. I would say basically in the book there's a couple of references to addiction, mostly for shock value in the way that we can see from even the cover of the book and its title. And basically Preciado argues that, his testosterone use, because it's not mediated by doctors in accordance with, some medically defined transition, whether it's based on, the WPATH standards now, or, whatever, the DSM-5 and other criteria that used to exist previously, and that, he just sort of tells us in passing, renders him as being outside of the law and outside of, what is considered proper medicine and into the realm of drugs that are recreational. But then he doesn't really go anywhere with that, and I think that's a major oversight of the book. He makes this big deal out of testosterone itself being criminalized, particularly over and compared to estrogen, but he doesn't talk about what that criminalization actually looks like. By using addiction as a framework, he puts himself in this position where he's claiming membership to this group of people, which is heavily stigmatized, but then he doesn't actually engage with what it means to be part of that kind of group of people. The histories of criminalization, the histories of rejection from society, the histories of forced unhousedness, and the link that it has to mental health, quote unquote, and psychiatry, and the discipline of designating certain people as being mentally diseased compared to others, and disability studies generally. This is all sort of beyond what Preciado is doing in this work, and I understand that of course the book can only be so long, but I think if the idea of being a junkie, of addiction, is a framework that is being centered in the book, that it's something that he really should have spent more time with, and I think that was really something that has come back to me as a pretty big oversight.
To be clear, there is some really good shit in this book. The research that he does, in particular into the history of the contraceptive pill, is in my opinion really valuable. He also threads it into this larger story about how essentially modern pharmaceutical and media systems have invented ultra-straightness and ultra-cis people. Modern contraceptive pills, patches, and implants, for those who don't know, are basically feminizing HRT, aside from copper IUDs, of course. It's either estrogen-based, progesterone-based, or a combination of both. Another aspect of it, according to Preciado, is that initial test subjects of the pill in Puerto Rico were given it every day, all month long, and therefore tended not to get menstrual periods. In most cases, they reported preferring it that way, aside from the sterilization, of course. However, as Preciado describes, When the pill was imported to the global north and the sterilization part was fixed, companies changed it so that pill takers would skip a week every month or take sugar pills for that week to stimulate a natural menstrual cycle. Or in the case of something like NuvaRing, you would take it out for that week. Because pharmaceutical corporations valued preserving the appearance that it was a natural menstrual cycle, as well as regulators, and that pill users should appear as natural women. To do this, manufacturers had to invent various methods for ensuring that women adhered to this rigid schedule of 3 weeks on and 1 week off, including specially designed pill compacts and packaging intended to make the pill taker surveil herself and ensure she and everyone else in her household could know whether she was taking them correctly. In fact, many Western pill takers do not skip a week and simply keep taking the HRT pills because they too prefer not to have periods. Let naturalness be damned. Another similar example Preciado raises is in relation to testosterone gel, the instructions of which warn users against virilization through secondhand exposure. Warning! Secondary exposure to testosterone. Virilization has been reported in children who were secondarily exposed to testosterone gel. Children should avoid contact with unwashed or unclothed application sites in men using testosterone gel. Healthcare providers should advise patients to strictly adhere to recommended instructions for use. Avoid unintentional exposure of women or children to androgel. Secondary exposure to testosterone can produce signs of virilization. Androgel should be promptly discontinued until the cause of virilization is identified. Exposure of a pregnant woman to androgel might result in potential hazard to the fetus. Androgel is not indicated for use in women. Preciado describes in several places throughout the book where testosterone has been withheld from people who are assigned female, even in cases where it was medically recommended or would be helpful, such as in 2004 where T-patches were attempted to be marketed to women in cases where the person's libido had crashed due to long-term usage of feminizing contraceptives. They were rejected by the FDA because, quote, despite the promising results of this substance in improving the sex lives of patients, its use does not seem to be justified. The usage of tea for improving sex drive in those presumed to be women was characterized as a lifestyle drug, and instead, doctors began to recommend vasodilatory vaginal creams, whose efficacy isn't really clear, and who basically, as the name suggests, replace the idea of actually experiencing arousal or a sex drive with just making your hole open more easily. What I think is really interesting about the anecdote about pills and periods, as well as the concerns about secondhand testosterone exposure, is how they show that what is natural is managed, and that biology itself is constructed. Preciado argues that this is uniquely modern, part of our new pharmacopornographic era where bodies are created in the image of drugs and porn. I'd like to argue, though, that this is actually something humans have been doing for a very long time. And it's actually just the way that the processes of human transformation are being regulated that has changed. Part 2. Take a step back for a second. This part should probably come with a content warning for sexual abuse, including sexual abuse of minors, as well as extensive discussion of reproductive rights issues.
Like, one of the things that Preciado essentially talks about is, like, if assigned female at birth people can embody conventional masculinity, that somehow in and of itself is transgressive. I just don't buy it. Like, it's pretty interesting. He straight up at Audre Lorde and states in one quotation, basically, he is directly advocating for using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, and in his sort of like formulation, that would be embodying conventional masculinity. And it's just kind of like, why, dude? What do you, as, you know, like a white European trans university professor who ends up being fairly conventionally masculine presenting, and, like, you know, there's lots of depictions of sex throughout the book. Most of the scenes depict him topping, and even the scenes in which he, like, bottoms, it's very much about, like, the irony of that and, like, being topped by a femme person and how, like, it expresses, like, the masculinity of that person.
Actually, my love affair with VD is the apex of a sexual career as a conquistador without a cock, which began in my very innocent childhood days. Since 5th grade, I've gone out with only the sexiest girls of the class. I don't see why, on behalf of my mental health, my first psychoanalyst insists that I relinquish my desire to fuck only those at the top of the femininity pyramid, the alpha bitches, the super sluts, a desire that she calls megalomaniacal. She thinks this desire is excessive because I'm not a cis male, who would simply call the same thing self-esteem. When he talks about taking testosterone, he describes himself as, quote, waiting for my beard to grow, waiting to be able to shave, waiting for a cock to grow from my loins, waiting for girls to look at me as if I were a man, waiting for men to speak to me as if I were the one of them, waiting to be able to give it to all the little sweeties, waiting for power, waiting for recognition, waiting for pleasure, waiting.
Oh my god, don't even let me fucking get into, like, the weird racial overtones of some of the sex scenes. Apparently, they feature in large portion a dildo that is brown and which is named Jimmy, as in Jimi Hendrix. I have no words.
Overall, Preciado's relationship to race and whiteness is utterly bizarro and would probably warrant an essay unto itself, though in my case it would probably just be an hour of me sitting in a bathroom screaming. Like, he continually refers to himself as supposedly white, or someone who appears white, even though he doesn't identify with that. And like, bro, you're literally white. Like, just accept it. This isn't like some kind of like mistaken identity situation. You're Rachel Dolezal in this situation. You can't just identify yourself out of this one. You're literally Spanish. For example, in Can the Monster Speak, he says,
"But the most important thing that I discovered is that in the patriarchal colonial system, being a so-called man and so-called white, I could accede for the first time to the privilege of universality, a peaceful and anonymous place where everyone leaves you the fuck alone. I had never felt universal. I had been a woman. I had been a lesbian. I had been a migrant. I had known otherness, not universality."
He then argues that taking hormones is a decolonization of the body, which leads to an extended comparison between transness and colonization that I feel less than great about. The trans body is a colony. Every day, on some street in Tijuana or Los Angeles, St. Petersburg or Goa, or Athens or Seville, a trans body is killed with the same impunity that a new occupied settlement is built on one bank or the other of the River Jordan. Medicine and clinical psychology are waging a war to impose and standardize the organs of this trans body. This also comes up in Orlando, my political biography, where he frames the transformation that Orlando undergoes before becoming a woman as becoming the native, the colonial subject, which also made me, in a bad way. This is especially glaring because the source material is incredibly racist. The book Orlando begins with the scene of the title character waxing lyrical about his ennui while using a severed Moorish head as a piñata. In fact, there's a later sequence in the book where Orlando, having transformed into a woman at the same part as Preciado depicts, goes to live with quote-unquote gypsies, whom to my Arabic-speaking eye are clearly just depicted as being Middle Eastern people and not actually Roma. And Orlando is exceptionally racist toward them and is eventually kicked out of their community. But Preciado frames this same sequence as Orlando, and thus trans people in general, and him in particular, being transformed by their transness into colonized subjects, which he depicts in the film by having racialized actors portray Orlando in this part of the story.
Je suis Coriangelis Brown, y dans ce film, je serai l'Orlando de Virginia Woolf.
The film itself, as I described, is bizarre, but it fits this weird Orientalism Preciado keeps participating in, alongside this desire to, on his part, to identify with the same people he's fetishizing and othering. Like, this part in Testo Junkie, where he talks about his one transmasculine partner, a dude named Victor, he uses this description, quote, "He is the beauty of an Arab smuggler, the elegance of a rogue who reads Artaud, and the calm of a pharaoh's dog, Lamphao even." And the thing that's frustrating about this is so many of these white academics don't address the ways that transgender is necessarily complicated by race. Even Daddy Judith Butler, in discussing Aretha Franklin's line, "You make me feel like a natural woman," says, "Thus, I feel like a woman is true to the extent that Aretha Franklin's invocation of the defining other is assumed. You make me feel like a natural woman. This achievement requires a differentiation from the opposite gender. Hence, one is one's gender to the extent that one is not the other gender. A formulation that presupposes and enforces the restriction of gender within that binary pair." Which, like, okay, sure, definitely maybe. However, to me, as a non-white person, it seems very obvious in this case that Aretha is probably referring at least to some extent to the ways that natural womanhood are defined on and against the bodies of black women, see the only book I've ever read, and the way that with a lover, the idea of white femininity and tenderness could possibly be embodied by a black woman. maybe for one of the first times in her life. All of this just reveals to me that once again I need to make a bigger and longer race and gender video, so stay tuned another 18 months for that. But returning to his hyper-masculine performance, for me, the thing with Preciado is, like, you can't overthrow patriarchal masculinity just by becoming it as a trans dude person. That's not how it works. In the chat with Halberstam, he expresses that he believes heterosexuality is over, since the proliferation of the pill, sex and reproduction are no longer linked.
I'm now fully convinced that the binary epistemology, the gender, sexual binary epistemology, race epistemology, normal pathological epistemology that we are still working with at so many levels is collapsing. And had started to collapse already at the beginning of the 20th century. In a sense, the whole history of the 20th century, including Nazism, including the atomic bomb, including the reform of democracy that we have known, could also be read as a way of trying to keep and fix this binary regime, which is what the colonial patriarchal mode of production that we know, that is capitalism, needs to effectively work. And I think that that's, you might think that I'm crazy, but that's the way I think. What can I do? You know, it's like you have to accept what the way that you see things and embrace them, and sometimes from Uranus.
But this is a utopian dream again, because
no, I don't see it as utopian.
You could say, and this is the kind of question that you've asked me in the past, whether we're in a post-binary world, sort of happily for capitalism, and that binarism has long since ceased to be the supporting system for the structures of exploitation and extraction, and in fact have already been replaced by multiplicity.
Yes.
And in fact the points, for
I'm not saying that the shift that is taking place is going to be for the best. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying no. What I'm saying, anyway, I mean,
it could go. Yeah.
Well, what I'm saying is that epistemologically, we are going through an epistemic shift that can only be comparable with the transformation that happened between the 15th century and the 17th century.
So he claims this, like, technical victory for queerness because the straights don't make a babby every time they do a cream pie or some shit. And, like, this is also a rhetorical move that Jack Halberstam makes in his No Church in the Wild speech. Truly bonkers, by the way, to watch a straight-faced anarchist analysis of a Kanye West / Jay-Z video in the year of Hysteria in 2024. He also misgenders Angel Hayes like 50 times in it. So much fucking hate. Basically, Halberstam in that speech states that he sees all these expressions of anarchist sentiment in corporate media, like the titular song or the Pixar film WALL-E, and rather than that making him question how effective those sentiments actually are, he ends up saying that that proves that, like, anarchism is slowly winning in the background while nothing actually changes.
The song saying, okay, Jay-Z and Kanye, I'll see your No Church in the Wild and I'll raise you.
See, this world has been designed for the guppies and niggas and eyes power, really the biggest puppets. No church in the wild, we governed by fucking animals. Hello, Mr. Obama, comma, Mrs. Obama, comma, future elections. Hello, Hillary Rodham, tell me what are the stakes? Boiling pot to the plate, you can kill some, steal some, what the fuck does it take?
Mark Fisher in Capitalist Realism, one of the things that he says is, how is it that capitalism keeps its hold on you? Basically, it gives you things like animated films that seem to have a critique of capitalism in them. You think, oh, okay, the critique is already out there, and you go back to doing whatever you were doing. I think he's wrong. I think that these little films are anarchist in so many different ways that they are responding to a kind of childish fascination with collectivity, with wonder, a fascination with the imagination and with the idea that the world can be different.
And to be fair, I'm not actually that familiar with Halberstam's work, including The Queer Art of Failure, which is his book that I believe this lecture is based on. I kinda just bounced off all his stuff that I've tried to read, most notably Female Masculinity, which I did unfortunately trudge all the way through. But in both Halberstam's and Preciado's cases, they seem to sort of be claiming this theoretical win for radical forces. It seems laughable to me in the hell realm we're experiencing a mere 10 to 15 years later. Like, the idea that heterosexuality is dead in the era where Roe v. Wade has been overturned in the the era of the Haktua girl, in the era where women of color are literally being criminalized for miscarriages, where sex ed is being banned, and where trans healthcare is being withdrawn across the board. Like, bro, I want whatever you're smoking, because that's not what we're seeing out here. Heterosexuality is unfortunately very much still alive and kicking. This is probably a good place to return to the homophobia, actually, and maybe talk about the one trans guy Preciado fucks, Victor, again. We've taken to being two guys as far as we can. We've got nothing, neither back rooms nor dicks, but there are more dildos where we live than the cocks in all the saunas of Paris. Like, listen, bro, I'm no stranger to the feeling of, as a queer trans guy, having a yearning for gay male culture as a whole. I've made several videos about it, as well as a whole-ass video game about my yearning to go to bathhouses in particular. A yearning which, at time of recording, I have rectified. But the way Preciado talks about his clear attraction to dudes has a very strange tone. Quote, "These months form a long tunnel of sex, drag king days, tantric rituals, soft packing, days of incest and vampiric sleep that I go through in a semi-conscious state with the certainty that someone will end up taking me out of this infernal paradise." The fact that he describes his relationship with another trans guy as incest, thus invalidating it, as well as the way he continually refers to the impossibility of fulfilling his clear sexual attraction to Guillaume Destin, just goes to show that he thinks of gay sex as something that necessarily excludes him. Regarding Guillaume, he says, "I don't call you so that I don't have to tell you that I'm going to start taking testosterone. I should speak to you about it, inform you of it. Now that I'm going to transform myself into one of yours, we'll be able to fulfill that old dream of fucking each other. I don't know that these days are the last before your death, and I don't call you." This kind of explains why he thinks of gay sex as this weird gotcha hypothetical, like in the weird section where he talks about giving all the cis women tea as part of a bunch of absurd other ways feminism could have been tried. Sorry about that. I had my strange basement noises start up, but we're back. Here we go. As a contraceptive method, feminism could have made masturbation obligatory, promulgated a sexual strike among heterosexual and fertile women, and advocated lesbianism en masse, made it obligatory to tie the fallopian tubes at adolescence, and legalized abortion and made it free, if not permitting infanticide when necessary. It was possible, from a biotechnical point of view, to require all women who are of childbearing age to take a monthly microdose of testosterone as both a contraceptive measure and a political method of regulating gender. Such a measure would have ended once and for all sexual differentiation and the hegemony of heterosexuality. This doesn't mean that cis females, on testosterone, would stop having sex with cis males, but the act would not continue to be interpreted as purely heterosexual. It would have no reproductive goal. In addition, it would no longer be a question of an encounter between two people of opposite sexual orientations, but rather between two people of gay orientation, with the added possibility of vaginal penetration. Like, ooh, what if cis men fucked a pussy, but on a guy? Wouldn't that make them gay? Like, yeah, bro. Sure, it would, but not in the way that you think. But because he doesn't have experience with it, at least at the time of writing this book, he can't imagine what it would actually be like to fuck a man as a man, to experience intimacy and love between and among men, and the ways that it actually still does embody power dynamics between cis and trans men that, in my opinion, can only be accounted for by the ongoing misogyny that trans men experience even after transitioning, and which you can only experience by going on Grindr as a cunt boy. To kind of return to my original point, I feel like the way he deifies testosterone as this vehicle for embodying conventional masculinity in the book is just kind of yucky. I mean, I know that people in general seem to want to know how to be men, and what men are supposed to be like. What does it mean to be a non-toxically masculine man? A lot of people are asking and trying to answer these questions. For Preciado, it seems like the answer is this kind of thrilling, hyper-real embodiment of masculinity, of manhood, of energy and power and sexual virility. And like, honestly, I get the appeal. I've been going through this experience over the last few months, and my broader experience with working out and masculinizing my gender presentation over the last couple of years, and I can see my body becoming more masculine in the way that people respond to that. It's thrilling. The feeling of safety, of being able to go undercover in men's spaces, and the feeling of gaining strength in your own body. It's incredible to watch your body change into what you knew it was supposed to be all along. how good that feels. And that pleasure is sexual. Of course it is. At least for a good number of us. I mean, how could it not be? For me, so far, one of the most gratifying experiences of taking tea has been each time my partner looks up between my legs with wonder in their eyes and cum on their lips and says, "Your dick is so much bigger than it was before." Or, as Preziato puts it, the possibility of fucking her for the first time with a mega dildo triggers a wave of tea in me, and heat spreads through my skin from my coccyx to the neck, flows through my arms and seeps to the point of my tongue. I know the value of my dildos, and I glide molecule by molecule into artificial islands while I evaluate which will have the privilege of fucking her first. I take hold of these centimeters of pure pleasure with my 5 fingers, the same ones that will later explore the center of her loins, go back up and into her mouth, caress the internal walls of her throat, and descend the digestive tube to the colon. And while that is, steamy, I don't think that model of masculinity based on strength, dominance, and sexual virility provides anything different. If you're, as a non-binary trans-masculine person, doing normal masculine things, fucking your normal feminine partner, and in this truly bewildering and horrifying scene at the end of the book, sitting and palling around with a bunch of straight male filmmakers, laughing about how one of them coerced an underage girl into making CP with them, and then watching the video together, like, what the fuck makes you different from those other guys? Just because you presumably have a vagina? I don't think that's it, dude. I don't think that's what being a man is. I don't think that's what we should aspire to. And like, to be fair, I don't think that's what Preciado thinks we should aspire to either. He writes that last scene as a kind of horror, him and his partner kind of sitting there watching it unfold. But on the other hand, he doesn't show himself using his newfound power and status that he has as a man to confront the other men about the violence that he perpetrated. And Preciado becomes one of the men in the room, watching silent or laughing, allowing this kind of behavior to continue, tacitly equating what it means to be a man to sexual violence. I think, as a man, as men, we can do something different. We should, but first we bring you this emergency interruption.
And now, Dicks.
This construction is happening along North Michigan, starting at Houghton Avenue and going all the way to State Avenue.
Okay, we gotta talk about the horniness thing though. Like, at this point, this could become a regular segment on my channel. Let's talk about being horny! Testo Junkie is a remarkably horny book. In addition to its being about anatomical sex in large part, it contains a number of sex scenes, some of which are, hot, and some of which are a bit more questionable. For example, here he describes getting a manicure for the first time. Everything is organized with Leibnizian geometric strictness. I sit on a small stool and she settles in facing me, asks me to give her my hands. First she touches my fingers, then she slides her palms under mine, almost all the way to the wrists. She takes my hands and raises them to the level of her eyes. I feel exposed, naked. She places my right hand in a small container filled with lukewarm pink cream, the color of white skin. The experience is completely lesbian. An idea goes through my mind. She's aware of handling one of my sexual organs. All the cis females sitting in the waiting room and reading Vogue know very well why they're here and what they've come to do. She begins to massage my left hand and laces my fingers with hers, then pinches the tips before moving back down to the arch of skin at the base of the first phalanx. She's giving me a counter-sexual handjob at the arm. How's that, she asks. Nice. Very nice. I don't look at her while she's touching me. I can understand what a cis guy must feel when he goes to a massage parlor and pays for a girl to jerk him off. The difference is nominal. They call it sex, and the women call it beauty treatment. Preciado describes in some detail his experience of increased libido and testosterone, and kind of attributes that as part of his addictive relationship with the substance. In fairness, I do get that. Even while observing a fairly fixed tea-taking protocol, I found that as my levels of testosterone have climbed, so too have my libido, and my practices of, let's call it, self-exploration time. And like, I've always been a pretty horny person, but recently the texture of my arousal has been kind of different. More urgent. That feeling of like, when I'm horny, I actually have to get off right now or I might die. For me, however, this rampant libido has been really positive and affirming, whereas Preciado attaches this kind of stigmatized addiction framing to it. For him, testosterone and sex are twin obsessions that he's spiraling into. For me, it's been more like the alleviation of my dysphoria has led me to feel feel more present in my body and open to its capacity for pleasure. Whereas for him, quote, my only drugs in all their romantic or anonymous variations are testosterone and sex, which form in that way a circle of mutual production. Of course, Preciado doesn't identify with having dysphoria, which I bigly have thoughts about. For example, he clearly has a great deal of bottom dysphoria, which is revealed throughout the book, but he doesn't see his gender inside that framework because he associates the idea of dysphoria with a structured, doctor-supervised transition, and so again, he has to write around it and find another explanation. From his perspective, testosterone makes him better able to embody conventional masculinity in his outward interactions with his partner and in the world, more so than changing his internal relationship to his body. This really doesn't reflect how I relate to my sexuality on T, nor that of many trans-masc folks I know. Like, sure, becoming more masculine appearing can make you more confident in being top-ear dominant, but for myself and most trans-mascs I know, it can just as likely make you feel able to express more feminine gender presentations and bottoming, to make you feel more secure in being man enough to try out new things. I definitely will say, for me personally, I've gone from being a true verse over the last couple of years to being much more bottom leaning. I also really was not into front hole play for myself before, and now I'm obsessed. Not only because my dysphoria is less, but I honestly feel like it feels better now. Also, you know, we only have this one set of parts, and testosterone makes them hunger. This actually relates to a small but cool study that I found that indicates that vagina havers with high levels of testosterone actually tend to grow prostate tissue in their vaginal canal or surrounding that area post-vaginectomy. T really is the need to get rail juice. Also, my increased libido has led me to consume a lot more porn, and this is also a subtopic of the book that's worth examining. Again, it's worth saying, as my friend Molly pointed out, and shout out to Molly, what a homie, love you dude. They pointed out that Preciado clearly comes from a second / kind of burgeoning third wave feminist academic background, and it's so evident, especially whenever he talks about porn and sex work. You can tell he's descended from the Judith school of queer theory in such a clear way in these parts. There's this long and jargon-filled section where he argues that porn shows sex in the performers desubjectified, meaning without agency, and therefore arousing the viewer, which then makes the viewer actually desubjectified because they're experiencing this kind of physiological response. Quote, on the one hand, the spectator receives the impression by the means of the desubjectification of the porn actors that he's the one who possesses the potentia gaudendi, sexual power or life force of the actors. On the other hand, the body of the spectator is being reduced to an involuntary receiver of ejaculatory stimuli, thereby putting them in a position deprived of any power to make sexual decisions. So basically, he's reinventing the no-fap movement from first principles, ostensibly feminist and for queers now, though. He then argues that the performative power of porn proves that sex in general is always performative. He kind of tries to have his cake and eat it too, by gesturing to queer porn creators, but in general, he seems to believe that all porn is objectifying and reductive in a unique way that's characteristic of our era, and to the extent that queer sex workers are doing something radical with it, they're just kind of pointing out the fuckery, well, pun intended, not actually breaking out of the structures, and just gesturing to the ways that they're subjectified. Quote, those who had been passive objects of the pornographic and the disciplinary gaze, women, porn actors and actresses, whores, hags and dykes, perverts, crips, etc., become subjects of representation, thereby putting in question the aesthetic and somatic political codes that make their bodies and sexual practices viable, and producing the impression of the natural stability of sexual relations and gender relationships. I don't know, not to be flippant or anything, but a lot of the time when I encounter radical feminist arguments against porn, I find myself being it's a fantasy, right? Obviously, we can talk about the working conditions on porn sets, which Preciado does not address as a problem in and of itself, but just kind of as something inherent in sex work. And obviously, fantasies are not ideologically neutral, but I don't know, just because I look at furry porn doesn't mean I want to be until I'm full of eggs, unless, nor for that matter, of course, does it imply that I condone or am into real bestiality. And the idea that porn defines society's desires kind of seems like putting the cart before the horse. Yeah, most straight porn contains images of infantilized women without agency being used as objects, but that's just straight sexuality. It was in society before porn as we knew it today existed. And yeah, of course, media perpetuates social narratives, but it's not like it comes from modern porn exclusively. It's, circular. In general, Preciado's pornographic era ideas come across as the internet is ruining youths because of access to porn, and just feels mad ahistorical. I've mentioned them on this channel before, but shunga illustrations have been a thing for 1,000 years, right? There's also cool ass Islamic porn from the medieval era, like the Perfume Garden, which reflects its own time period, such as the idea that conception can only be achieved if the bottom comes. Let's bring that back, by the way. There's also some really amazing indigenous androgynous erotic stories with animal and spirit creatures, like Tales from the Smokehouse, which has these incredible illustrations by Daphne Ojig, and depicts the ecosexual ethic of indigenous cultures. I think part of what Preciado is trying to argue is that modern plastic surgery has allowed porn actors to embody this hyper doll-like idealized body type, but versions of that have always existed, from the pseudo-classical bodies of the Renaissance, more Rubenesque body types, the heroin chic of the 90s, to the sort of de-racialized hood baddie aesthetic that was popular recently but seems to be on its way out. Now dudes are into big titty milfs, I guess. The first video essay ever, Ways of Seeing by John Berger, is literally about this. But the point is, there have always been ideal body types and people striving to meet them, as I discussed in the previous chapter. I actually think the bimbo and doll aesthetics that are popular now are such a high-level response to this. There's a really sharp awareness to that ultra-plastic, slick look that I honestly love. The babes are doing so much, and we don't deserve them. And of course, we have to say that this aesthetic was pioneered by trans femmes of color, as were most of the things that we love and enjoy. In contrast, in his 2019 lecture, Can the Monster Speak?, Preciado argues the following, quote, "Why couldn't abandoning femininity not become a fundamental tactic of feminism? This amazing association of ideas, lucid and magnificent, must have hatched somewhere in my womb, since women's creativity is said to reside solely in the uterus. And so it must have been in my rebellious, non-reproductive uterus that all the other strategies were conceived, the rage that made me mistrust the norm, the taste for insubordination." To me, when Preciado proposes abandoning femininity as a core strategy of feminism, it just reeks of this rancid, not like other girlsness, the sort of desperate spitefulness of political lesbians who aren't even really into women, but simply won't act on their desires for men as a perverse gotcha. It's one thing for you, Preciado, a whole dude, to abandon femininity, like, for sure, go off on that one, but like, if you're really advocating for women as a whole to abandon femininity, maybe you're just revealing that you don't like women, my guy. And again, throughout the book, as well as writings of his like Can the Monster Speak, it's just challenging to tell what's a genuine proposal on his part and what's just shitposting. And also, it just seems wildly hypocritical for him to, again, to condemn porn in general, while also showing us in the last scene of the book, it turns out it wasn't the last scene of the book, but it is toward the end and I repressed the rest of it. But anyway, him sitting idly while he's witnesses this truly horrific footage that was captured under circumstances of genuine abuse. He doesn't seem to make a distinction between that and other types of porn, even though in that case the coercion and this minor girl's inability to consent clearly make it an exceptional circumstance. It kind of reminds me of how organizations that claim to be anti-sex trafficking often equate all sex work to trafficking, thus alienating sex workers and ensuring that the organization actually can't help people when they are being trafficked. Once again, I find myself wondering, what can a different masculinity look like, one that's healthy and grounded while still encompassing the wild eroticism ever blooming inside me?
Part 3. Something different. Imagine that the god Dionysus stands before you and rests his wand, Thyrsus, on your shoulder. The Thyrsus, wound with ivy, might be a woody stalk of fennel unearthed from the ground, still dangling roots with a fine white threading of hyphae, dew slicked and perfumed with dirt. It erupts with leaves, fruit, and flowers. When Dionysus lowers his wand to touch you with it on your shoulder, it will catalyze you into mystical ecstasy and perhaps transform you into an animal or plant. He is initiating you, not into a linear patriarchal narrative of knighthood, but into the gestalt consciousness of his chaotic, vegetal, polytemporal belief sphere.
I'm fresh out of the bath, as you can see. Hope it's alright with you that we keep chatting like this. I generally read in the bath these days, and I have been taking a lot of baths. I'm definitely in my bath era. So I've been reading, this book is a bit of a palate cleanser, The Flowering Wand by Sophie Strand. I've read it before, I'm kind of just rereading it. And what I like about it is it's sort of like it's an analysis of a whole bunch of different styles of mythology, and these kind of like masculine figures that are grounded in the land. So she talks about, for example, like Bacchus or Dionysus, depending on whether you use the Greek or Roman name. And then she also talks about figures like Pan. She talks about even like making the argument that potentially Jesus is a land-grounded figure, and also from other traditions as well. But I think I'm particularly really interested in Dionysus, and so I really like that. And what she kind of advances is these types of deities are sort of like grounded in the land itself in a way that other sort of like sky god type of deities, like, you know, Ra, the sun god in Egyptian mythology, or like Zeus, are sort of removed from the land as sky deities. And she argues that the modern Christian God is a version of that, as is the God of the Old Testament. And she says that that essentially represents like the dichotomy of, you know, like colonial or toxic masculinity and true masculinity, or like a more rooted and traditional form of masculinity, which like I keep hearing is a thing that people in society want. So I think that that's a really interesting exploration, if that's something that you're curious about.
So I sat down to do some drawing yesterday. I did the inking of that Preciado drawing. There we go. So as I was drawing yesterday, this Preciado drawing, I had mentioned that I was unlikely to actually sketch on camera ever, because I usually sketch while I'm like sitting on the couch watching TV or whatever the fuck. But actually for the second piece that I worked on for this one, which is based on the like flowering wand section, I actually will do a little sketching because the drawing is still pretty rough. I actually had a previous iteration of it, which was this one. I'll try and show it to the camera better. So, yeah, I wasn't super happy with it. I actually ended up going back and doing some thumbnails, which are probably really light and not super visible here, but just to give you the idea of what they looked like. And yeah, the thumbnails are always super helpful. I started to think a lot more about like construction lines and putting together the thumbnails, like putting like an X and then the like rule of thirds makes it so that you can really see like In The Flowering Wand, Sophie Strand lays out a different idea of what the masculine is. In contrast to the dominant, powerful, rational, and disconnected archetype of patriarchal masculinity, she presents an older and more rooted archetype of masculinity. Merlin turning into a hare to learn the wisdom of the woods. Dionysus, who as a kid kept turning into a baby goat. Asterion, the Minotaur, born from the union of a woman and an animal. The sacred bull, which symbolized pre-Hellenic religions and relationships to the land. If in ancient mythologies we think of the sacred feminine as the land itself, the waters, Tiamat or Oshun, then the sacred masculine can be identified as that which communes with the land, which links and studies and connects, like a rhizome linking two trees together so they can share nutrients and chemical communications. Let us give back to the masculine the ability to refruit and mushroom up freshly to fit changing circumstances and evolving relationships. Let us gift them fungal flexibility to experiment with creative, spiritual, and sexual expression, knowing full well that adaptability is survival. The more the masculine can adapt, the more able it will be to withstand strong winds and chaos. Like Dionysus, we can remember our deep pre-patriarchal root systems that help us stay grounded while still able to sway in a storm. Let us give masculinity back its flowering wand of reciprocal relationship with the natural world. Let us call Dionysus to the gates of our cities and homes, a man who can dance with plants and honor beasts, a man who can be a woman and an androgen and an animal is more than a gender. He is celebration, a hive of humming bees, a secret network of fungus ready to erupt as the air moistens, a murmuration of birds, a cluster of grapes, a throng of singing women, a magician. One of the titular flowering wands Strand refers to as a mushroom, which has been associated with masculinity across cultures. I wonder why. One of my favorite examples of this is described by Robin Wall Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass. She said, in Anishinaabe the word for a mushroom fruiting is the same as for getting a boner, papui. I stumbled upon it in a book by the Anishinaabe ethnobotanist Kiwe Dinokwe in a treatise on the traditional uses of fungi by our people. Pupoi, as she explained, translates as the force which causes mushrooms to push up from the earth overnight. I learned that the mystical word Pupoi is used not only for mushrooms, but also for certain other shafts that rise mysteriously in the night. Strand explicitly imagines a new kind of masculinity that we can see in conversation with Preciados. If Preciado is saying, people with vaginas can become biological men, and how does that now destabilize patriarchy? And my critique is that,
yo, actually, dude, if you just do all the same shit as other men, it doesn't destabilize patriarchy that much, then Strand is probably saying, okay, let's go back to our traditions and to the land and figure out a type of masculinity that can be embodied by anyone and that's deeply rooted, connected, and seeks to empower and connect those around it. And Strand also makes it clear that this land-based, land-connected type of masculinity also fucks. This masculinity just fucks in a more mixed up, interconnected way, a weirder way. Need me some of that mushroom rhizomacy, that maenad pegging. Isn't it strange that the god of phallic wands, probing vegetation, wine, and lovemaking is often characterized in Western academic settings as asexual? The argument is strange. Extraordinarily, Dionysus is one of the only, if not the only, Greco-Roman god who does not commit rape. This is one of the main arguments Western scholars use to argue that Dionysus is abstracted from actual sexuality and couldn't possibly be a virile, desirous lover. He does not behave like the dominant patriarchal pantheon he's nestled inside. This simplification of Dionysus seems suspect to me. His femininity and androgyny, his long hair and strange dress, the other measures of his otherness, are also included in these attempts to neuter and erase a pre-patriarchal mode of the sexual masculine. Why is masculinity conflated with dominance and violence? Why does the fact that Dionysus has no interest in domination mean he can't be a sexual, passionate lover? Why does his atypical physical presentation preclude him from sensuality? Well, stranger, I see this body of yours is not unsuitable for women's pleasure, says the Theban king Pentheus in Ian Johnson's translation of Bacchae. As for your hair, it's long, which suggests you're no wrestler. It flows across your cheeks. That's most seductive. You've a white skin, too. You've looked after it. What is it about Dionysus's unclassifiable beauty, his ability to inspire the appreciation of both women and men, that disturbs academics and kings alike? Let me offer an alternative narrative. What if the fact that Dionysus does not need to commit rape or violent assault in order to attract his lovers make him even more masculine? What if the ease of his masculinity, the biodiversity of forms and possibilities he represents, causes the rigid and monolithic masculinity of patriarchy to contract around its lack of options? One story that depicts this is that of Dionysus and Ariadne, in which Ariadne, after being rescued from the Minotaur, being married, read fucked, and then abandoned by Theseus, is finally rescued by Dionysus. After she's restored, she's depicted sitting on a throne with Dionysus in her lap, their roles seemingly reversed. Yet it is precisely this experience of power and autonomy she needs to heal and regain her strength. What if the masculine was about being a conduit to that kind of strength, and giving and receiving it in equal measure? Ariadne is depicted as occupying the sovereign throne, while Dionysus sits in her lap. Their relationship is flipped, dynamic, unfettered by gendered stereotypes. There is no dominating king. Informed by an adaptogenic ability to bring balance to a disturbed ecosystem, Dionysus immediately corrects the power dynamic by elevating his beloved to divine status and giving her back her earthly throne and cosmic constellated crown. At a time when 1 in 3 women have experienced sexual violence, Dionysus might be an important role model for the masculine. What does it mean to approach the beloved knowing they have been wronged? What does it look like to tenderly heal that wounding and that power imbalance? My guess is the answer is more luscious and beautiful and sexy than we can even imagine. Healing doesn't have to be hard work. It can be romantic. It can be a bacchanal. What if masculinity was about connection, of listening to our intuitions and being guided by our dreams, of going out into the woods and listening to what the trees have to say? If the feminine is the embodiment of the power and generative potential of the land, then the masculine is its sense of connection, its wandering offshoots. And I just want to clarify here that Sophie Strand emphatically does not use the masculine to mean inclusively men or people assigned male at birth, nor the feminine to mean exclusively women or people assigned female at birth. For example, in a section where she discusses the connection to the moon as part of attunement with natural cycle, she says this: people with wombs have always known that bodies and consciousness are cyclical, tied to a rhythm that's larger than the individual. The cycle is 28 days, full moon to full moon. Moon sounds like a name or a noun, but let us remember that moon is a gerund, always moving, always mooning. It is time to give the masculine back its lunar knowledge. Wombs swell, yearn, mulch, and release in 28 days. But a womb is not just an organ. It's an invitation that anyone of any physicality and any gender can accept. It is an invitation to dance inside change for 28 days, to practice softness for a cycle. The masculine has a womb too, a moon. All it need do is look up at the night sky. In the furry visual novel Minotaur Hotel, the Minotaur Asterion, meaning the starry one, is depicted as being bound to this magical hotel, which the player character inexplicably inherits. When you encounter him, he is emaciated, starved of connection, of relationship, of sustenance. As he connects with you and you reopen the hotel together, he becomes this visual archetype of masculine strength, a huge bull man, and yet all he wants is to serve you and the other patrons of the hotel, to ensure they have good food and a comfortable stay, that everyone is taken care of and he's a bottom. For me as a masculine person, this feels much more like something I can grow towards, As my body changes, as I get stronger, I want to feel like my strength is building something. Habitats, places for my kin of all species to shelter, to restore what's been lost, and to make room for my relatives to thrive. As I have more energy, more passion, and become even hardier than I could have ever thought was possible, I want to use that drive for connection, to seek out other beings to be with and things to learn about, and learn new ways to be with my body. I also really want to make some space to counter Preciado's assumptions that autonomy around gender expression and changing one's body are modern inventions. Instead, this kind of body modification has been around since time immemorial. I've already discussed elsewhere my relationship to plant medicine, and particularly ashwagandha, as part of my transition. I used the tincture for 2+ years before beginning testosterone, and I experienced a number of changes, including to my voice, exercise ability, and libido. This is in keeping with a lengthy tradition in South Asian and Islamic medicine of use of this herb for masculinizing and libido enhancing purposes, as well as more generally as an alternative. Here's a clip of me before ashwagandha.
What does it mean that some of us can just not work, and what does that tell us about capitalism itself?
Here's me at 2 years, shortly before taking testosterone.
Not sure that what I want out of this is visibility exactly. To be honest, I feel kind of gross and weird about visibility. It feels like being bought and then slowly having the parts of ourselves be sold back to us. What is visibility when the more they see us, the more they hate us?
And here's me now at about a year of testosterone.
Let's try that again. So if you can introduce yourself however you feel comfortable for the video.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Ayelet, like Ayelet from the rooftops. And I live in unoccupied Canarsie and Muncie Lenape lands, otherwise known as Brooklyn, New York. I am a trans woman, transsexual, and I am also an herbalist. I've studied herbalism and I've been practicing herbalism for many years. And my focus is mostly on trans feminine health, both hormonal, emotional, spiritual, and surgical.
Amazing, thank you. And I also want to say that you are a wonderful teacher of herbal knowledge and herbal transition care, which has been my most lovely experience with you.
Thank you. I consider you to be a teacher as well. And around the same time that I started medically transitioning, I was working in the medical fields. At a job which was very discriminatory around my transness, and where one of my bosses had told me that if I started hormonally transitioning, she would no longer be able to hire me. And also at the same time, I was really pursuing my herbal journey as well. So kind of like simultaneous to this focus on medicine as a pathway towards wholeness and self-realization, I was pretty active in these two realms where medicine in one case, plant medicine, in the other case, pharmaceutical medicine and biomedicine were kind of like the main themes. Yeah, so I was really kind of active in those realms. I was kind of starting to research whether herbs could have the potential for any kind of feminizing effects. And I came up very short. Both who has access to medical care and who should have access to medical care, our stories are pretty intense gatekeeping, where the primary storyteller of that story is the medical industrial complex, where historically a lot of different kinds of trans folks were gatekept from medical care because their story didn't line up with what the medical industrial complex perceived as kind of like truly trans or truly like transsexual, quote unquote, at the time. And so I didn't fall into a lot of those criteria. And even though it was a little bit more open, it had shifted somewhat at the time. This was 2014, 2015. I think it was just like beginning to start to shift in a more significant way around that time. There was still kind of like that common perception that yeah, like the threshold, like the window was very narrow. And if you were to pass through that window, then you have to be of a certain story, of a certain narrative. And that was something that I had internalized at that moment.
In what you previously said, you mentioned that like while you were kind of navigating that internalized sense of gatekeeping and transmisogyny, that you became like interested to find out how you could interact with like plant allies in that process. Can you tell me a bit more about like what getting into that looked like for you, and like how you kind of continue to navigate with that?
In effect, I was just researching that with an herbalist mentor that I was working with at the time, but it was mostly through like herbal textbooks and things like that. I didn't really get into like internet forums about that. But what I do think is really interesting, and this is of course like I can only speak for myself and my story, and this is not something I'm interested in like essentializing in any way, but I do kind of think about how my process of transition and my process of getting into plant medicine and just kind of like being more attuned to kind of like the ecosystems and the life around me happened around the same time. And I don't think that that's coincidental. I think often there's this perception that transness, and especially like quote unquote transsexuality, or like the kind of transness which requires some kind of medical, or not requires, but for which is desired like some kind of biomedical intervention, that path somehow takes us away from the earth, or like away from like ecosystems, and kind of like transforms us into a category that's like separate or compartmentalized. Where what I have experienced personally is the opposite, where the more I'm able to feel wholeness with myself, and the more I'm able to even imagine for myself a sense of wholeness in my body, in my being, then I'm more able to engage with kind of like my place in ecosystems around me from this place of wholeness, rather than from this place of kind of like fragmentation or non-wholeness.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Thank you. I think that's something that is sort of animating this whole project, is my sort of like, I get the sense that Preciado like embraces the artificiality. Like, not only does he agree with the idea that like trans people are artificial.
There is kind of like this material difference that is very real, where it's like once certain materials are synthesized, then it's like it doesn't interact with the earth in the same way, and that's not like a science I necessarily understand so much. So I try to be cautious about that in my own way, but I do think a lot about these things, where silicone is synthesized from silica, which is a material that exists in plants and bodies in the world as a whole. It's like rose quartz and beach sand. This is all silica. And I think about how even like most of the facial fillers that I have come across, and we think of like people who get like work done on their face as just like being very kind of like plastic or synthetic looking or whatever. And a lot of these fillers, like hyaluronic acid and polylactic acid, the primary way that these are produced is through fermentation. And I just think that, again, we're dealing with a newer substance, like they're synthesized. And so we don't know how those substances in their new form interact with the earth. But I just think we can't get away from the earth is where I'm at with that. And I respect people who identify as like being artificial, or I'm not so well versed in like cyborg or android discourses but I respect that realm, and I'm intrigued by that realm. But I do think it's really interesting that like a lot of the kind of like thresholds that we hold as those that if one crosses those thresholds, one crosses into this world of like plastic or synthetic. Those thresholds themselves are comprised of the earth, like inescapably. And it just very interestingly, in the case of like facial fillers and silicone, one can get into all these different stories about these substances, both stories that are really beautiful and kind of like, I don't know, earth connecting, and also stories that like any material in, like white supremacist capitalist world is going to be really fucked up as well.
Yes.
As you mentioned with the like Israeli production of a bunch of different hormones, that a lot of trans people who are, just like this interesting thing where most trans people I know are like fighting for a free Palestine in their own way. And at the same time, we are reliant on these substances, which may or may not have been produced by, the genocidal state of Israel.
Yeah, totally. And I think it all kind of keeps coming back to me of like that, no matter how artificial or removed we think that any of our selves or like these substances that we interact with is, that like they're rooted in the world.
With regards to the realms of holistic medicine, which I include herbalism in that, and the realm of biomedicine, I really try to strive to the best of my abilities to facilitate and highlight a relationship of synergy where and so in that sense, I think they can be really complementary. And I'm not saying proceed with no caution. I think that there are ways in which we want to know what we're doing. And I think that we should do our research with any intervention, no matter which realm it comes from. And I think that any intervention can be done or can be kind of like wielded in ways that are harmful. I don't think that any kind of intervention is inherently good or is inherently like immune from violence or corruption. But yeah, I think, when it comes to, for example, herbalism and biomedicine, then I see those as carrying a lot of potential for working in synergy with each other. And as one example, I have taken this herb. There is this Thai herb that we know from kind of traditional Thai medicine. The Latin name is Pueraria mirifica. I don't know how to pronounce or to do justice to the pronunciation of the Thai name, but I can write that in the chat to include in the notes as well. Sure. But I learned about that plant from this other white trans woman herbalist named Josephine Voyager Parker, who took this plant as a way to try to facilitate different feminizing effects such as back growth, fat redistribution, breast growth, things like that. And that very much worked for her. And I had already started my pharmaceutical transition in a way where I wasn't really willing to stop that. But there was a point where I was wondering what kind of an effect Pueraria mirifica would have if I was already taking pharmaceutical hormones. And a lot of the material that you'll see on kind of like internet forums and things like that is pretty alarmist about that. They'll be like, don't take phytoestrogens, which is plant estrogens, along with pharmaceutical estrogens, because they'll block the estrogen receptors. And I have to say that is true for certain kinds of plant estrogens. And so the alarmism doesn't come from nowhere. And there's a lot of like ways of wielding plant medicine that is scammy and exploitative. And again, a further testament that any kind of medicinal practice can be wielded for harm. But I decided to experiment with Pueraria mirifica, and for myself, I noticed that in addition to the breast growth that I had received from pharmaceutical estrogen and pharmaceutical progesterone, there was this other kind of breast growth that I experienced while taking this plant. And so that's just one way in which I found this herbal route to be complementary to each other. And it's not to say also that in order for a medicinal intervention to be meaningful in any way, it has to be equal to or greater than the kind of like brute strength of kind of like pharmaceutical medicines. There have been countless ways in which herbs have been absolutely key to me transitioning. And a lot of those ways do not have to do with body modification, but they do have to do with a realm of transition that people don't talk a lot about, which is the emotional and interpersonal and even like spiritual aspects of transition, where it's like, it's really intense. It's really, really, really intense. And it's intense. And I'm not of the mind where it's like, some people say, well, the only thing hard about transitioning is transphobia or transmisogyny. And I'm like, I wish I could say that. But in a sense, I also think that any kind of transition in the world is such an immense undertaking. And, we have deeply embedded into many intact spiritual cultures around the world so many rites of passage and rituals around major transitions, such as puberty or birth or death or marriage or menstruation or all these things. And transition as like this is just this really, really, really intense experience that happens with oneself. And change is beautiful, and it's also really harsh. It's a metamorphosis. And herbs have been extremely helpful in inviting more ease and more softness and sometimes more clarity and allowing space for grief, and in ways where we don't have pharmaceutical medicines for that. And in fact, I would argue that it would be very hard to even think about pharmaceutical medicines for these kinds of emotional, spiritual processes where just like, but plants have this intelligence, and we, and specifically like, you know, traditional cultures have interacted with plants in these ways forever. And sometimes with regards to gender transition itself as well.
Yeah, I think the question of like effectiveness is something that I feel like as herbal practitioners, like we continually are like engaging with and being confronted with. And as you kind of beautifully illustrated, it sort of seems beside the point to a certain extent. For me personally, there's no question as to its effectiveness, as I've spoken to you about, and then also like on this platform. And I think like people like I don't know if you remember, there was this weird scam going around last year. You know about this?
I do. I know about this, and I talk about it all the time, and I feel like we've talked about it too.
I think so. The folks who were like attempting to sell, to my recollection, feminizing, like selling to trans feminine folks these like herbal pills that were allegedly some kind of like ashwagandha extract or powder, which, as we know, is primarily used by folks for masculinizing purposes, as like a sort of like scam attempt to like stymie trans feminine folks' transitions, which is just like so bizarre to me on so many levels.
Yeah.
And then like the response, I don't know if you saw, it was like so many folks being like, "Oh my God, this dosage like will kill you," or whatever. Like,
yeah. Yeah, totally. It was so scammy. I mean, like the product itself was so scammy, and then the response kind of like, just like the pendulum swung to the kind of like exact opposite direction, where it's like 600 milligrams of ashwagandha will cause serotonin syndrome. And in essence, these people were trying to murder trans women, where I'm just like, there are people in the world who are trying to murder trans women. And this person is scammy as fuck, you know, and also, can we like, where is there room for ashwagandha, like this traditional holistic plant that is more useful for transmasculine people? But I know people across this gender spectrum who have taken various doses of ashwagandha, and I've never read anywhere that it can cause serotonin syndrome. And I think that like, yeah, it's like the pendulum just swung in this really intense way, and the kind of like more nuanced, traditional, like holistic approach to ashwagandha as a plant, and also ashwagandha itself, kind of like as, you know, a whole being, just kind of got lost, and it became kind of like cannon fodder.
Yeah, totally. I think it's so interesting because like at the time I literally was taking like 600 milligrams of ashwagandha a day and had been for years, and I was like, I'm a pretty small person. Like, if it was a dose that could kill anyone, I would be the person who would be killed.
Yeah, we were talking about this, and I hope I don't do injustice to your words, or kind of like share something we were discussing before this, but you were talking about the ways in which I think is very real, that kind of like transmasculine experience in kind of like more archival settings and in more popular culture settings is not as well documented or like studied as like trans feminine experience, which I am with you around that 100%. And interestingly, when I started my journey as an herbalist, I felt the inverse a little bit in herbal settings, where this was around like 2012, 2013, 2014. My first herbal teacher ever is a transmasculine person named Jacoby Ballard, and he put out this zine around herbs for surgery support, and it was very much based off of top surgery, or just kind of like, double mastectomy, top surgery. And there were all these other resources that were pointed out to me that were mostly transmasculine focused. And most of the other herbalists that I encountered in the field were transmasculine. And it does make me think about just the ways in which, like, I don't know, herbalism and kind of like holistic medicine and kind of like, I don't know, people, this word alternative medicine is so like loaded and complicated, but I do think that kind of like alternative medicine from like an alternative culture perspective of like, we're not finding like the kinds of resources in the spaces we need to find them. And so we're going to go to these other spaces in which there is a little bit more freedom and agency. And so I did have a read that like, that's perhaps what transmasculine people were doing with the field of herbalism or holistic medicine, where it's like there wasn't as much attention paid to transmasculine experience in these other realms. And so perhaps in herbalism, there was just a little bit more room to do this kind of like DIY research thing. And so that was very present for me when I entered into the herbal field and just like saw very few trans women, very few trans feminine people. And so for me, basically, it was about filling a niche. And when I first started researching herbs and kind of feminization, there wasn't, in the realm of herbalism, there wasn't a lot of information. And the information that I ended up finding mostly through my friend Voyager, and in part through my friend Bill DeHaya, the informational realms that Voyager opened me up to were mostly outside of the realms of herbalism and more in the realms of kind of like trans women internet forums and kind of like M to F magazines and things like that. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of like bridge these realms a little bit more and have some of this information be a little bit more research-based and clinically based, and just fill this niche where I just didn't feel like there were herbal providers who were offering this kind of service. And it was also this thing where I feel like I did a lot of research, and this is just like mostly a funny thing in the world, where it's like I did a lot of research in herbalism and kind of had this presumption, because I was hanging out with a lot of herbalists, that my like knowledge was very basic, where I was just like prepared for a scenario where I would be like, oh yeah, spearmint has been used historically as like testosterone reducing, and have people around me be like, okay, yeah, sweet, we know, like or like whatever, like tell me something I don't know. And then I realized that like outside of herbalism realms, like this information is actually pretty golden. Yeah. And this information is actually not really basic because people just don't know about it. And so what I was really interested in doing is, I don't know, a lot of herbalism is very kind of specific and self-referential. I'm trying not to say that in a critical way. I do have critique, but I think that herbalism can speak to a lot of people who are already interested in holistic medicine. And I wanted to bring herbalism to these places where I felt like trans women would frequent more, or just like these kinds of like realms of experience that speak more to trans women. Yeah. In part because, well, I won't get into it. There are many reasons, but I won't get into it.
If I can interject, because I think this doesn't need to remain unsaid. There is such cis sexism and like a trans misogyny and like a focus on like female bodies, quote unquote, in herbalism as a space that I, for myself as a trans masculine person, have like benefited from in an incredibly unpleasant way, but that I could see the inverse of being a sense of exclusion and a sense that that's not a space for trans women and trans feminine people that I think I see your work interacting with.
Totally. And then and I think that a lot of the things where it's like that I was frustrated with was like, we would have these whole big classes on like phytoestrogens, but then the extrapolation of like, how does that speak to trans feminine experience? That's work that I had to do on my own. And at the time I was really frustrated with that, and frustrated with my teachers. And now I'm really grateful to my teachers, in part because like, I think that honestly, if they had tried to do that extrapolation, they would have flailed or whatever. And I think that like, actually, I don't know, I think that I have a little bit of like a different, more kind of like approach where it's actually good that we're doing a lot of the extrapolation process around this information and not having that done for us, because I honestly think that nobody can do it better than we can. And I maybe wouldn't trust that kind of extrapolation.
100%.
But yeah, I think I just really was trying to bring herbalism. I think like I was trying to bring herbalism outside of the limited realms of herbalism, into kind of like spaces and realms of experience that really speak to trans feminine people. And yeah, and it took me also going outside of the realms of herbalism to realize that a lot of this information is not really basic and can be really helpful for people in their experiences.
Word. So it's 3:30 in the morning, a nice crisp and juicy 3:30 in the morning on the Trans Day of Remembrance. A 1-year anniversary of Testosterone is today. Happy birthday to me. It's also the arbitrary deadline that I set for myself for this project, so I'm struggling to get it done. This is the last thing that I'm recording after I've finished editing the video. And just wanted to put a little conclusion to this story. I have to say, reading Testo Junkie has honestly been such a weird experience. On the one hand, I'm really grateful that Preciado and people like him exist, and that people who transitioned, decades ago documented their experiences. To see older trans people living and thinking about their experiences is such a blessing, no matter what. And I really connect with his desire to interrogate taking testosterone and why he wants to do that. This was not an uncomplicated choice for me either. I really hate doctors and medical institutions. I hate them controlling my relationship to my body. It makes me deeply uneasy. And I also had placed a lot of weight before on being a trans man without this. Just like Preciado also thinks of himself as taking tea without being a transsexual, I thought that what it meant to be me was not to take hormones, and it was really fraught of a decision for me to actually decide to do that after over a decade of being out as a trans person. But for me, taking testosterone has been such a link to my community and such a beautiful source of reconnection with my body. And in a way, reading this book has made me more sure that this is what's good for me, rather than taking on the doubts that I felt like Preciado was expressing at the time. And there are moments in the writing where you can tell that that's kind of starting to come through for Preciado, the pleasure of embodiment, the joy of being with others like him, but it's also couched in so much doubt and jealousy and wanting to distinguish himself from other trans-masked people or other queer men. So I guess for me, the biggest conclusion is being grateful for being alive when I am. Not that this is the best time to be trans or whatever, especially even more so than when I first wrote this. And like, in my case, the best time to be trans would probably have been 1,000 years ago. See image from Erod. But just like, I'm grateful to live in a time where there have been a few decades of resurgence of trans people thinking and being out loud, for me to witness and think critically about, including Preciado's work. As one of my script readers, Ducky, pointed out, people like Preciado had to DIY hormones when people treated them like freakish addicts, while they were doing so a couple decades later, so I could smoke my legal homegrown weed and do my shot with a friend intertwined in loving community. So I guess if you're watching this, Paul, thanks and sorry. Special thanks to the folks who gave me feedback on this video as a script, Ducky aka Felix, as well as Alice, and also thank you so much to Ayelet for joining me for the conversation at the end of the video. And if you like this video and you want to have another one within a year, maybe consider sending me money for it. Thanks. What progress in every sphere of knowledge in the ignorant brain of a simple transsexual prepared to put a shoulder to the wheel.